You're live.
Welcome back, folks. This is House Corrections and Institutions Committee. It is the continuation of our Wednesday morning, January 11th testimony. We have with us our State Treasurer, Michael Pichek, and we're going to be going over generally the bonding issues, generally how the bonding capacity is determined, also background in terms of the Debt Affordability Committee and what the committee looks at, what are the metrics that they look at that then feeds into what our bonding capacity is. So we're just going to have a general overview of bonding. We're going to have a general overview from the State Treasurer's Office in terms of how they operate, when they might go out to bond, what they look for, that type of thing. I know we have a new state treasurer. He does have some other folks here from his office that has his back.
Yes.
And we really appreciate you coming in so early in the session. I know that you're treasurer, you're new on this particular piece, but you have an extensive background in finance. So I apologize for having you in so soon after taking your oath of office, but our work is really contingent on understanding the structure of how the state treasurer operates in the bonding world and how that impacts us. So welcome, and if you could just identify yourself for the record.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. Mike Pichek, Treasurer of the State of Vermont. And I'm joined, as the chair mentioned, by a few folks from our office that I also wanted to introduce. First, our Deputy Treasurer, Gavin Boyles, who's sitting right here to my left. Gavin was our General Counsel at the Department of Financial Regulation for the last 5 months. Was Assistant General Counsel at the department prior to that, over at the Attorney General's office in private practice, clerked at the Supreme Court for a number of years. And fortunate to have him at the Treasurer's office, and we've worked well together through all sorts of things at the department. So we'll certainly benefit from his experience. And Ashlyn Doyon, I think everyone probably knows, Director of Policy, Financial Literacy and Special Projects, which doesn't even encapsulate all of the things that she does, even though it is a broad title. So she's been the glue for the Treasurer's Office for a number of years and continues to be in the early days of our administration as well. So she's our Director of Policy, so she's the point person in the legislature for us in terms of finding the right people to testify, getting answers to questions that you might have, testifying herself. So certainly any issues that you have, please direct them to Ashlyn and she'll be able to take care of them. And then Scott Baker, who's our Director of Financial Reporting. Scott's been with the Treasurer's Office for about a decade, I believe, a little over 11 years. And with the Vermont Housing Finance Authority prior to that for a number of decades, and has been really an expert in all things debt related. So when these topics come up or when you have really specific questions, Scott is likely the person that's going to be in here testifying. So wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to for those that are new, have opportunity to meet three of these great folks. For those that might have been on the committee before, at least get a refresher as to who they are and the role that they play in the Treasurer's Office. So we provided a PowerPoint that I just wanted to walk through, but feel free to interrupt whenever you might have questions. As the chair indicated, sort of a broad overview of, what are bonds relative to the Treasurer's Office, the bond ratings or the credit scores and why that's important to Vermont. An overview on the Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, or CDAC is the acronym. Discussion about Vermont's debt ratios, because that's what CDAC looks at, a few debt ratios to determine its recommendation. Talking about bond rating priorities. And then we have here a capital expenditure cash fund. We'll actually talk about that earlier on, but that's something that is a new creation that will be important for the committee to understand as well. So just a broad overview, what are bonds? In terms of making an analogy for our personal lives, a bond is like a home mortgage. You are taking out a loan for something that is a significant or a large purchase, and then you're paying that purchase back over time. So it's something that's going to last for quite a while. It's a significant investment and something that will be something that will be around for decades. That's worth putting the investment into. Vermont bonds, like a mortgage, have a fixed interest rate, so they'll be paid back over time, typically 20 years. Statutorily in Vermont, it's a 20-year term. So that's unlike a mortgage that traditionally it's 30 years and might have a lesser rate. A couple of other things that differ from this mortgage analogy. We make payments on our bonds for interest every 6 months and principal every 12 months, as opposed to paying your home mortgage, both principal and interest on a monthly basis. We have level payments, so the amortization is, the earlier in the process the principal is being paid off on the bonds, as opposed to a home mortgage where that principal is being paid later in that borrowing process. So that's good for the state. Due to contractual negotiations, oftentimes these bonds can't be refinanced until 10 years, unlike a home mortgage when your interest rates get better and you go and seek a lower rate. Most of the buyers want to be able to lock in the rate that they're getting for some period of time. So generally the bonds for 10 years are set at the interest rate that they're issued at. We guarantee repayment of these bonds from our general fund, so the full faith and credit of Vermont, as opposed to your mortgage that would be collateralized by the property that you are buying. So if we make a bond for a building in Montpelier, that building is not the collateral; it's the general fund, full faith and credit of the state of Vermont. And then there are a number of large purchasers when we issue bonds. Institutional investors, retail investors, credit unions, banks. It's not like making a single loan from an institution. There are many different purchasers of our state bonds. So just an analogy in terms of something that probably everybody has some familiarity with a mortgage, and how bonds are similar to them and how they have some differentiation as well. So something we wanted to touch on, as I mentioned, the capital expenditure cash fund. So this is in opposition to bonding. You can pay with cash. It's called PAYGO is another term for it. A lot of states have moved in this direction of trying to pay big expenditures with cash rather than bonding. The principal objective, the principal benefit of doing that is not paying the interest rate that you would pay on bonding. Of course, you have to come up with the money up front, and that can be challenging in budgetary environments across the country, including in Vermont. But we did establish a capital expenditure fund here in the state of Vermont. It was funded by $25 million, I believe, and also a request by the Secretary of Administration, Department of Finance and Management, to come up with a funding mechanism so that this could be funded in perpetuity going forward. And there's a report that's going to come out on that, a recommendation later this week about funding that fund. So it's something that we have just started here in Vermont, a concept that Beth Pierce has certainly talked about for a number of years, but it's something that is new. Rating agencies generally view this as something that's credit positive. You're having less, you're bonding less, and you're paying for those long-term investments up front. Obviously we've mentioned that you will be doing the borrowing without the interest, but of course, for it to work effectively, an ongoing payment stream will be necessary to replace the bonding capacity. So the concept there is not that you're necessarily doing less capital expenditures, but the way in which they're paid would be different. So going to page 5 of the slide deck, you see the Treasurer's Office as it relates to the bonding and the role of bonding statutorily. The Treasurer's Office is responsible for managing the state's bonds. These duties relate to things like managing the sale of bonds, the ongoing administration of state bonds, paying out the principal and paying out the interest when those are due, monitoring for refinancing opportunities. So if interest rates are lower and we can retire some debt or refinance some debt at a lower cost, managing our relationship to the credit rating agencies and our credit rating, our bonding score, credit score. That ongoing relationship is critical, really, and important for us to prioritize contracting for all debt-related vendor services, so investment bankers, lawyers, financial advisors, economists, paying agents, and the like, making sure that we are in compliance with federal and state laws and regulations, which is obviously important and critical. And then the Treasurer chairs this entity that we mentioned, the CDAC, the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, and delivers the annual debt recommendation, although that is now sort of done once a biennium that we'll get into here. But the legislative committees consider the CDAC and debt recommendation when creating the biennium capital bill. So that obviously means we have an important relationship here with the committee and our office. So just an overview on page 6 of the bond ratings here in Vermont and the major credit rating agencies. These may be familiar names to everyone, but Moody's Investor Services, other generally go by Moody's, S&P Global Ratings, S&P, and Fitch Ratings are the 3 major credit rating agencies. You can see their bond rating charts on the right. All have a AAA status, which is the highest that an entity or state can obtain. There's a number of other statuses there where you're a very high quality, very low risk, and then it goes down into a lower investment grade. So you'll see on the left a bullet that in July of 2022, Moody's and Fitch affirmed the state's rating of A1 and AA plus with stable outlooks. And then in August, S&P affirmed the state's rating of AA plus, but upgraded its outlook from negative to stable. So that was viewed as a positive in this past summer.
So we have, I guess, some questions. Chip.
So when Moody's looks for ratings, is the health of the general fund what they look at, and the ability to would result in the ability to pay back the bonds that we're negotiating? Is that primarily what the rating comes from?
Yeah, so I think if you think of it as they look at the general fund, but then they look at the components that sort of spill into the general fund, and the 2 main items that have been identified by each rating agency is the state's unfunded pension liability, and that can obviously impact the general fund if those liabilities require more resources from the general fund. So they look at the state's unfunded liabilities, and then for Vermont, they look at our economy, or more specifically our demographics. So if you have demographics that are getting older and a workforce that's getting smaller, they are under the impression, and rightly so, that in the future you'll have less tax revenue,
right,
and less ability to pay the debts that you owe. So those are the 2, and there's a slide here on the next page, but those are the 2 factors. But it's good because the slide.
Yeah, lead in, yeah. Okay.
But those are the 2 factors that the rating agencies highlight as issues for Vermont, generally uniformly across the board.
Okay, great, thank you.
And the reason we went from negative to stable for S&P is because of the pension deal that was passed by the legislature last year, where a significant portion of the OPEB liability was retired, and they viewed that favorably. And they also viewed favorably the recent population growth that Vermont has been experiencing during and post-COVID as well.
Yep.
So you're going to explain your 3rd bullet there about the interest rates, because that also has an impact, not just on the state level, but on our municipalities. Just want to make sure that people see that.
So Vermont has the highest rating in New England?
That, but it also translates into lower interest rates.
Oh, yeah, of course, right.
But it's not just on the state level that is insured, it's also on our municipal levels.
Yeah, exactly. Anybody that takes the benefit of Vermont's moral obligation, so it could be UVM or VSAC or the state colleges or bond bank, Vermont Housing Finance Authority. You know, if the state's moral obligation is backing all of those different entities, the better our bonding rating, the stronger our financial position, the better risk they will be, as well as the state of Vermont as well. And as you see, we have the highest bonding rating of the New England states across the board. And as the chair pointed out, that results in the lowest interest rates, also known as basically just the cheapest borrowing costs. So as I mentioned, on the next slide, there's a little bit of an overview here about Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, and their most recent affirmation of our rating, and then also identification of our credit strengths. We didn't really touch those too much, but our credit challenges, and we identified those, the unfunded liabilities and economic growth / demographics. On the positive side, what they often point out uniformly is Vermont's above average educational attainment, low unemployment, and another thing that should be identified for this committee and for the entire legislature is the strong fiscal management of the state from a budgetary perspective, from a financial perspective. But they view us as being well run, having strong reserves, having good liquidity. And that is obviously due to the relationship that the legislature has with the administration, with our department, with our agency, with each other, and being able to pass balanced budgets and have strong reserves. So look at Vermont's overall debt strategy on page 8. We have had in Vermont a conscientious and consistent effort to maintain our excellent bond rating. As we mentioned, that's important, not just because of the lower interest rates, which is really a dollar pocketbook issue, but also it signals the strength of our economy, gives us a sense of how we're doing relative to our peers, and just the strong management of our state and our finances in general. So we have continued to try to achieve the lowest possible borrowing costs for Vermont taxpayers. Since the 1990s, Vermont has also had a strategy of reducing outstanding debt. And there is a need to continue that approach per the CDAC for a number of reasons, but one of which is that is a trend nationally. States are taking on less bonding debt, and that trend has picked up and continues across the country. So as we get into the metrics that CDAC uses, the median has been moving in a direction that Vermont is hoping to follow, which is a reduction of outstanding debt. And that's been a pretty strong and consistent approach for the state, like we said, since the 1990s. In terms of our debt profile, it's relatively straightforward. Most of it are general obligation bonds, so GO bonds. There is a note here about transportation infrastructure bonds. Those were backed by a fuel assessment on motor vehicles, but those were fully redeemed in June of 2022. So those are no longer on our books. So generally, the state is a pretty straightforward debt profile of general obligation debt. Our bonds are 100% fixed rate. That level principal produces rapid amortization that we mentioned that pays off that principal more quickly as it's level over time. And then 2 items here: capital appropriation changes adopted by the General Assembly have improved this process. There's a 2-year recommendation now. So when CDAC gives a recommendation, it's for the full biennium, the 2 years. And then we are able to use bond premium to reduce the amount of the issuance, which is a little bit technical. And if you have questions about that, I'll let Scott answer them. We'll move on.
That will be next year.
So you can see here the CDAC recommendation. It's visualized here. We'll have some more. We'll have another slide that goes into it in more detail in a couple of slides. But the recommendation for this biennium is $108 million spread across $54 million in the 2 years. You can see how that has been a reduction in terms of the recommendation over time. That is consistent with our adjusted for inflation reduction in outstanding debt over the same time period. So, what does that mean if you have less outstanding debt? You could make the argument there's less capital investment going on, but, at the same time, there's a hope that this cash fund will replace some of that bonding that is occurring now. But the other thing that it means is less interest being paid by the state's general fund. So just as an example from the CDAC report, the interest that we paid just on our general obligation bonds in 2004 was $56 million, $56.4 million. The interest that we paid in 2022, fiscal year 2022, was $38.9 million, adjusted for inflation. So we're paying less for interest, which means we have more money available to pay for other projects and services as well. So something to keep in mind. It's not just the low interest rates that are important, but the amount of outstanding debt reflects how much interest you have to pay in a total percentage as well.
Can you repeat how much of what interest payments we're doing in?
So just the total payment, 56.8 million 2004, fiscal year 2004, 38.9 million fiscal year 2022.
So that's
in terms of the borrowing costs, not necessarily the interest rates, but reflective of how much debt was outstanding.
So that line item that's in the general fund budget, say it's 79 million. So for FY24, 56.8 million of that was for interest.
In fiscal year 2004?
Yeah, 2004.
Yeah.
It was So say it's 60 million was our line item for our debt service. Of that, 56 million was just for the interest alone.
Yeah, for the general obligation bonds. I mean, there are other debt that is being serviced, but just as an example, for these general obligation bonds, that the more debt you have outstanding, it is real money on an ongoing basis, $10, $15 million in this instance.
Then in FY '22, I don't know what that line item was. It was probably around 70 million, maybe high 60 millions. 38.9% of that was.
38.9 million, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, 38.9 million was the interest alone, not the principal.
Right. And there's other debt that is being serviced too, but a significant amount is the interest rate and the interest being paid.
Okay. And also for the committee, if you look on this chart, we started implementing the 2-year budget cycle for if it was FY11 and FY12 is when we switched over to a 2-year budget cycle. Prior to that, we were on a single-year budget. But we split up. If you look on 2011, 2012, in 11 it was 71.8 million, and then 12 was 76.6 million. So we had a total capital budget of 2 years, and I'm just going to round off because I don't do math in public, of 148 million, 147 million, instead of what we currently have at 108. Wayne?
So looking at the graph, obviously we hit, a high in 2013 or something. So are we actually doing less capital construction, or are we being switched to cash?
So the cash is a very new concept, so it hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
So in terms of your question though, at least as it relates to the current time period, I can't speak necessarily to 2013 to 2020, let's say, but there are a number of reasons why these capital projects are not necessarily underway. The state of the economy, the state of labor, other funds that are available, federal funds to compete for capital projects. So that is built into the CDAC recommendation for this year, why it's lower partly. But yeah, those are some of the
So they don't
considerations.
necessarily reflect the lack of projects, but the timing of some of the projects being able to draw money.
Yeah, and I think it's both. I think it's that, but there's also some, as the CDAC report will go into, there's some concerns about economic volatility, cost of borrowing at the current moment. So I think it's a reflection of both the economic realities and the labor realities, and the fact that there's other money. We don't have this cash program set up, but there are other federal sources of capital projects at the moment, which is unique relative to any time in recent history.
So if I can add a little history to this, if you look on the 2008, 2009, 2010, part of, and then it peaked at 80 million, and then it started to go down. Part of the pressures around the capital bill at that time was we had a high debt, high obligation in our school construction dollars. We owed our communities close to 80 million, pushing $100 million in obligation. And that came directly out of our capital budget. And we put a moratorium on that in 2007, 2008, that there wouldn't be any more state aid in helping our school districts with school construction projects until there was a plan in place on how to go forward funding it, because it was all on the capital bill. And our municipalities had completed their school construction projects and had not received their state obligated dollars. We had to pay that off. That didn't get paid off until about 2016, 2018, right in there. So it took 10 years to pay that off within the confines of our capital budget. So that was some pressure that was there. Then Irene came in 2011, and we had a tremendous amount of pressure on the capital bill to replace what we lost at the Waterbury complex, and also to replace fish hatchery that we lost. That was all on the capital bill. Yes, we did get some FEMA reimbursement, but FEMA comes in after the fact. So we really put in a lot of capital dollars in rebuilding our infrastructure of the Waterbury State Complex, of building a new state hospital, building a new environmental lab that was destroyed, moving A&R to a different building, National Life, and doing the renovations up there, and also repairing a fish hatchery. And so that's why you see those numbers really peaking at that particular time, because we had those responsibilities, and now we're starting to see the numbers go down. Just to give a little historical perspective in terms of what happens out there in the bigger world, the people think the capital bill is just isolated to bricks and mortar. And if it wasn't for this committee, and if it wasn't for the capital budget, there's no way we would have rebuilt the Waterbury complex. There's no way that we would have built in a mental health system with a state hospital and beds in Rutland and the retreat. There's no way that the fish hatchery would have been replaced. So that's the importance of our capital budget and how it works out there with these projects, that people just don't make that connection.
Yeah, the critical investments in the state from a societal standpoint and an economic standpoint.
So we were the hub in replacing our infrastructure with Irene. And we were the hub for school construction. And we are the hub right now for water and sewer projects. So when all the federal dollars are starting to come in on their infrastructure bill, we're going to be in the thick of figuring out our state match for that and allocating some of that. So just a little bit of soapbox that I'm on. Tristan.
Do we know, Treasurer, do we know the total outstanding principal on our bonds? Is that figure in here somewhere?
So on the next slide, there is this is not adjusted for inflation, so just keep that in mind, but you'll see 579 million. This is in general obligation debt. I think the number in total net tax supported debt might be like 620 or 30 million.
Yeah, so the rating agencies also include some other stuff in total net tax supported debt, like any leases that we have. They just changed the GASB rules recently. It used to be just capital leases, and starting this past year, now all leases are included. So we went from 9 million outstanding capital leases to 83 or 84 million. So that's included. There are also some mental health bonds that PEPFA and VITA have issued in the past that at least Moody's includes in net tax supported debt. So yeah, those are, but they're not general obligation bonds, but they include net tax supported.
So these are just that represents all of the outstanding general obligation bond, not necessarily all the outstanding debt for the state of Vermont, but this is the primary amount of it.
Thank you.
And the reason that it flows in the way that it does, again, is that it's not adjusted for inflation. Those numbers, as you saw, have been coming down and have been coming down from the 90s.
Another question.
Yeah.
This is, I don't know if this fits in well here or anywhere else, but something I'm curious about. That my understanding is Vermont is not statutorily required to have a balanced budget, which is different from, I've told is different from importing in other states, but that we do a good job anyway with other means. Can you just describe kind of what, I'm telling you something I've heard, can you tell me what that means in practical terms?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is some constitutional and there are provisions in the Vermont Constitution I think that you could read as potentially suggesting there should be a balanced budget, but we don't have a statutory requirement to have one, but always do have one. States, unlike the federal government, can't print money to pay for things that they don't have current cash and current ability to make good. So all states are different from the federal government in that way. So it is critical for all states to have a balanced budget and not go into deficit. We do have reserves that are available, in the event of a significant economic downturn or some other event that was unexpected. So there have been years, I believe, it was quite a while ago, where maybe the reserves would have been a component of a budget. But that is an unusual instance. And generally, it's whatever the revenues that come up with match the expenditures. And that's a good, obviously a good financial practice, and the rating agencies will look at that as a general overview and a general sense of how a state manages its fiscal resources.
Thank you.
Chip?
So I'm puzzled. So if we bond $123 million for 2022, and we pay it back at, in a 2-year budget, we pay back $50 million of that bond. When we go back 2 years later, I thought you said we don't renew the bonds. We take a separate bond, or do we add to the balance of the bond that from 2022 and that just continues down the line? I'm not sure how that
If
works.
we were to sort of the equivalent of refinancing it.
Yeah.
So think of the bond as being issued today as a 20-year bond. Those are that's the term of the statutorily the terms of the bonds that we issue. So if I were to buy the bond, I would say, well, I want this rate of 3.5% fixed for some period of time. I don't want to in 2 years have it go down to a 2.5. I want it at 3.5, and therefore you have to commit that you won't call the bond, or you won't refinance the interest rate for 10 years. So I can, that's part of the rationale for doing the investment. So in year 10, if it turns out that, you can call the bond, or you can get a lower refinance and get a lower rate, then that would be done. And it's not an issuing of a new bond, I don't believe, unless Scott is going to correct me.
Yeah, well, so it would be issuing new bonds, but paying off the old ones. We would defease the other ones. They would keep the same maturity rate. So, for instance, the last bond issue that we did, we had $100 million of new money. We also issued about $75 million of refunding bonds. So we issued $75 million, took that money, paid off the older bonds. They kept the same maturities, but much lower interest rates. So we ended up saving about $7.6 million in total interest payments on those bonds.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
So I'm interpreting your question a little different, Chip. I'm interpreting it in connection with our capital budget.
Right.
So the way I interpreted your question was, last year in FY 22-23, we had 123 million.
Correct.
So the assumption is you're going to go out and bond for that 123 million right off.
Yes.
Which is not what happens, but that's the assumption.
Okay.
You don't go out and bond for the 123 million in that 2-year period.
Okay.
Okay.
What do you bond?
You bond for those projects that are ready to go forward.
Yes. Okay.
So your question, the way I interpreted it was, okay, so in FY 22 and 23, we had 123 million. So you've already gone out and bonded for that. So now we've got 108 million before us. So you're going to go out and bond for that on top of the 123. Is that what you were sort of thinking?
Yeah, but I was thinking if we're paying off at $25 million a year, are those joined together at some point?
Yeah,
or they
because
stay at 20
you've got a 20-year backup.
Right, yes.
You bonded 20 years ago for whatever level that was. So that would be in 2002.
Yep.
So when the state treasurer went out to bond then, it was incorporating what construction projects were ready to go. We're just finishing off, paying off those bonds. That doesn't necessarily go away unless you do 10 years into it.
Okay.
So you're constantly building on your bonding amount that you already have. That's why your debt load is increasing, because you keep feeding it.
Right. Okay.
And that's why the push has been to decrease our bonding capacity so it doesn't keep putting the pressure on the general fund to pay our debt load.
Yep. Okay. That does explain it.
But maybe it would also be helpful for the treasurer, and maybe Scott can help us on that. Now, because you're so new, you haven't gone out to bond yet. But what that process is in terms of what determines when you do go out to bond and what you look for in our capital budget. I think if we can shift to that, that might help, because it's right where the committee is.
Sure. So when you pass the capital budget, all the projects are listed, there's an appropriation for each piece. It doesn't necessarily mean we will go out and bond right away. We work with finance and management, and they poll all the departments for looking at the projects and saying, when will this money be spent? And they'll give them projections. And when we go out to bond, we'll say, okay, how much do we expect to spend on these projects in the next 12 months? Some of it, as soon as the capital bill's passed, some of that money will go out. And even if we haven't bonded for it, we'll use state's cash to fund those for a while. There's plenty of state's cash to do that. So when we go out and bond, there's a piece that when we get the money in from the bond issue, some of it will go to reimburse the state funds that have already paid for the projects. The rest will go in the bank basically to cover the projects that we expect to spend in the next 12 months. So that's kind of how we determine when we go out and bond. So then when we do bond, some of these projects are from capital bills, several years ago. Even though it's in the capital bill, the project may not happen for quite some time. So right now we have quite a bit of authorized but unissued. We have about $185 million of authorized but unissued, which means you have authorized that for certain projects from previous capital bills, but we haven't bonded yet. And the reason is a lot of the projects just they haven't spent the money yet, so we're just kind of sitting on it. So even though our debt right now, at June 30th we had $579 million of outstanding bonds, we still had $185 million of authorized but unissued debt. So if we had gone out on day one when you authorize that, outstanding debt would be much higher.
Okay.
Is there an expiration on that?
Sorry?
Is there an expiration on that?
Reallocations.
Yeah, so
is that-
Reallocations.
Okay.
right, and there is there are IRS rules about when you can bond. So there are basically reimbursement rules. So once you put money towards the project, once the project is placed in service, you have 18 months once it's to reimburse it, or 3 years once it's officially placed in service. So it depends on the project and what it's doing. Which is, even though we haven't bonded in quite a while, we're kind of looking at getting close to the 18 months on several of those projects. So we're looking at that. But we're also working with our bond counsel right now because even though we need to reimburse some projects, we still have some unexpended proceeds from previous bonds, and you can do what's called project swaps. So you kind of, use the unexpended money to pay for those projects that are coming up against the deadline, and kind of move those that you haven't spent into the next bond issue. So kind of get around that. But yeah, there are timelines that you have to consider.
How much, when you do go out for issuing bonds, how much do you usually go out? Is it 60 million? Is it 170 million? What's usually?
Yeah, so the last couple of issues have been right around just under $100 million of project proceeds. And that's just kind of the way it worked out. When CDAC met over the summer, they spent a lot of time looking at how much we've spent. At that point, we'd only spent about $30 million that we needed to reimburse. That's a pretty small bond issue. They're fixed costs to doing it. So
Right.
you want to get to a certain level that makes it work.
Wayne and then Tristan.
I was looking at this chart. Each one of these years, that's your total outstanding bond debt, right? So that could be 20 years, 19 years, 18 years, aggregate for each one of those, right? And so I was looking at, when I was first looking at it, I said, well, does that mean that the amount that you're going to have to pay back is going to diminish as we integrate in those real low years, into what we're paying now? Or, how does that reflect on the future 10 years, say the next 10 years or the next 20 years in terms of what we're going to have to pay back, not necessarily what we're going to
Yeah,
put new on top of that.
so I would think of each year as reflective of, the year that just happened and the next years prior to it. Yeah,
So it's like integrated into.
yeah,
each
it's
one of
right,
those.
exactly. And the other point just to make on, from what Scott just said, I mean, part of why what Scott is talking about is so important in terms of managing that process. If you were to have a construction loan for your home and your contractor's not ready to start building, like you get the construction loan, you're paying interest on this loan that doesn't have a project associated with it. So we, to issue the bonds when the project's not ready to go would just increase our borrowing costs without, bringing that project to fruition.
And once you do bond, you have to spend that money in a certain amount of time, but strict,
Oh, you do? Huh?
So,
Huh?
you can't just bond and say, spend it.
You have another question, Tristan?
Sherry, you mentioned school construction a couple of times. And I don't know if this is a rabbit hole, but I was curious if we get into funding for school districts either to help them reduce their bonding costs, if it's a larger pool of money, or just to help state funding go to schools that need it.
We had a structure that is outdated. It needs to be revamped. Our structure for school construction was we had a person in the Agency of Education that worked directly with our school boards and the architects to determine if there was an addition or renovations done to our schools. That there were some standards out there that are established by our State Board of Education in terms of what would qualify for state aid. So as an example is, say that the state standard for square footage per pupil is 20 square feet. And there was a construction project of a new addition. And the school was putting 20 square feet per pupil. That 20 square feet would be an eligible cost for state aid, but we would only pay 30% of that construction cost for that 20 square feet. We didn't pay 100%. We didn't, the formula was 30%. That's what the person in the Agency of Education worked with the school districts. If the school decided to do 30 square feet per pupil and not 20, the eligible cost for state reimbursement was 20 square feet. That additional 10 square feet would not receive any state aid. That would be picked up locally. So when they looked at a school building and say they were adding on a wing, doesn't necessarily mean that the whole part of that wing that the state would pick up 30%. We no longer have a person in the Agency of Education that does this. We need to upgrade our standards in terms of what are our educational standards. And we need to update the statutes. And then we need to find a funding source. Because what we ended up doing in the capital bill, we would hear from Agency of Ed, say, these are our obligations, these are the votes that have gone through for our school districts, for our buildings. This is like, say, Brattleboro, or say, Heinsberg, or say, St. Johnsbury. They had this addition. It's costing $1 million, but the state obligation to that million may not be 330,000, and it may only be 200,000, because there's some things they've put in there that don't qualify for state dollars. So that 200,000 there'd be a spreadsheet that indicates all the school districts and what our obligation was. Our amount that we would put in out of a capital bill was about $10 million a year. And it went directly to our school districts. So we no longer do that because we were about $80 to $100 million in the hole. And we had schools that had finished their construction, had not received any state aid at all, and were paying interest on that full amount of that construction project until they could receive the state aid. So that's why we put in the moratorium. So now when people talk, oh, we need state dollars to help our schools and our buildings, well, first off, you've got to find out what condition your buildings are in. And then you got to figure out what's going to be eligible for state dollars. Then you have to find out what your formula is going to be. And then you have to figure out where you're going to get those state dollars from. Because if you're going to look at the capital bill, and we only have 54 million in 1 year, and if you take 10 million off the top for school construction, and you got $120 million school bond in a town, 10 million, they're not going to get that 10 million because you got to spread it out around other towns. And that's what we got to grapple with.
And for any of the committee members that are interested, I would recommend researching the state of Rhode Island. They have a lot of similarities to Vermont in terms of a moratorium on school construction following the Great Recession and during the Great Recession. They are very generous with what they give their local municipalities and prior to that, and they have a very generous program going forward. But their state treasurer and their secretary of education came together to create a financing plan for school construction. They did an audit of all their schools, a very detailed audit to understand the exact condition of them. And then they put in a series of incentives and a series of limitations, as the chair is mentioning. And they seem to have held pretty strict to that. But it allows the state and the local to work together to get the final cost. But I think, there's quite a bit of exploration that would have to happen in Vermont on that point. But certainly our office would be interested and willing to be engaged in that conversation.
The key is to really have someone on the state level that works on behalf of the state and works on behalf of our school boards that understand and work in construction.
Yeah.
Because our school boards, our members usually are not immersed in construction.
Yeah.
And you can go to an architectural firm and say, oh, well, we need this. And the architectural firm doesn't care about the dollars it's going to cost. And they say, here, you can do this. Well, you need another check and balance there to say, hey, wait a minute, that's a little exorbitant. You may not need that.
I think the state of Massachusetts ran into that issue.
Yeah.
And now they have a form. I think you can have one of three choices now, basically, of a type of school.
Mm.
So that is the complexity, and it's deeper than that. It's much deeper than that. But that's the complexity of school construction. And that's why I have reached out currently to the current chair of Education Committee and said, when that feasibility assessment report comes back, this committee needs to be in the loop. Because ultimately, I'm sure that the capital bill will be involved at some point in needing to fund this. And there's been a lot of history in this committee on school construction. So, and it's understanding those nuts and bolts.
Maybe Monsanto's gonna pay.
I think so. You won't be able to tear down the building for 2 years.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Oh, Jesus, yeah. That's bizarre.
So maybe just now we can get into the Debt Affordability Advisory Committee and both what it is and then its recommendation. And there may be some questions there. So you'll see on page 11 of the slide deck that the CDAC was established in 1989. So it's been around for quite some time. This is something that's viewed favorably by the rating agencies that we have this process. Not every state has a process, but quite a number of them do, as you'll see on the next slide. But it is something that has shown good fiscal management. It's outside of the, maybe the political legislative process. It's a recommendation solely. It's not a directive, but it is sort of a process that occurs, separate and outside of the legislative process that is viewed as bringing experts to that conversation and coming up with a number that is rational and supportable. So annually, we review the affordability of Vermont's net tax-supported debt. The benchmark ratios that the CDAC uses are identified here. The amount of outstanding debt as a percentage of personal income in Vermont. So you can think of that as how much debt do you have relative to how wealthy is your population, how much personal income revenue is there. Debt service as a percentage of revenues. So how much debt service do you have relative to your tax revenues that the state of Vermont is collecting, and then debt relative per capita. So what does your demographics look like, and how much debt do you have relative to how many people are in your state? So if your state is getting larger and your per capita is moving in the direction that looks like you could have more capacity, if your revenues are getting larger, it looks like you're moving in that direction, personal income's getting higher, and basically you get a sense of where you are and where you're trending as well. So this is recommended from the CDAC to the governor and the General Assembly. As I mentioned, it's a advisory recommendation in practice, but I should also mention that the governor and the General Assembly have always adopted the CDAC recommendation. So it's advisory, but it's always been adopted, and that has also been looked on very favorably by the rating agencies as well as a general practice. And I just mentioned their CDAC as a structure considered good governance by the rating agencies.
I didn't hear you. Did you mention who sits on the debt affordability?
I did not, but
that might be helpful.
So the treasurer is the chair. The treasurer also selects an individual to serve on the CDAC that I believe has accounting and finance background. I think is sort of the expertise that's looked at. The Secretary of Administration is a voting member of CDAC. The governor has two separate appointments that the governor can make sort of with someone with that kind of expertise. So I believe that's 5. Then there are non-voting members. The auditor is a non-voting member. There's representative or representatives from JFO that are non-voting members as well. I think the state economists, Tom Cavett and Jeff Carr, usually attend those meetings as well as somebody from the Joint Fiscal Office. So I think that those are all the members.
And somebody from the bond bank.
Oh, of course, yeah, somebody from the bond bank, usually the bond bank president.
So no legislators. The only legislative entity that is there is Joint Fiscal Office, but they do not have voting rights.
Yeah, exactly.
So BGS isn't even on there.
I've been.
Yeah. Sitting on the sidelines, but in terms of,
I just can't.
You gave a good presentation.
So you just see on slide 12, some of the other states that have a process like the one we have in Vermont, the different colors sort of determine, whether it's a committee or whether it's the treasurer solely or whether it's somebody in the executive or somebody in the finance office. But you can see the number of states do not have one, but a number of states do, particularly in the Northeast, and it is looked at as a favorable, mechanism to have this kind of structure and process. So now getting into the recommendation for this year, there are, as we mentioned, there's been some more limited debt issuances by other states. It's been a national trend, and that is including in the peer group of states that Vermont looks most closely to. So our peer AAA rated states. So basically, we want to look at the states that we want to emulate and be like or move toward, and not the states that have lower ratings. So we don't look at all of the states necessarily in some instances we do, but in other instances we look at the best of the best to try to compare ourselves to those. So those states have issued less debt. It's weakened our debt ratios in terms of these comparative rankings that we mentioned. So the first year of the biennium, this recommendation has come out for a 2-year recommendation of $108 million. The $108 million represents a 12% reduction from last biennium's recommendation, and a 37% reduction from 2014-2015 recommendation. And then a couple of other points from the CDAC report. There was a recognition of the need to remain disciplined in making our actuarially determined employer contributions, not necessarily something in this committee, but this is basically the amount of money, both what are called the normal costs, the ongoing costs, and the percent to pay down our unfunded liability on our pensions and OPEB. The ADEC is the amount that is determined that's needed every year. So if we are paying that, then we're paying down our large unfunded liabilities. If we're not meeting that, then those unfunded liabilities are growing. And then continue to support reserve increases is also something that the CDAC has mentioned as it's important, as the rating agencies view that with importance as well. So not on the slide, but one thing I just want to mention, and we chatted a little bit about them, but some of the reasons that the recommendation is at $108 an 8 million, a 12% decrease from last year. The committee specifically called out five or six things, but economic volatility and uncertainty over the next 2 years, the competing capital projects that are funded by federal funds or local infrastructure funds. So the fact that there's a lot of other money available, but that there's also a lot of projects that are in the works that any bonded projects would be competing against in terms of getting started and getting completed. The impacts of labor and material availability and supply chain issues at the current moment. So how quickly could a capital project get up and running given the workforce and supply chain issues? Of course, inflation has been impacting the cost of doing construction at the moment. So if you were to build a project today, it would be more expensive than 2 years ago, 5 years ago. Hopefully it will be less expensive in 2 years and 5 years. And then the increased borrowing costs that would come from doing bonding now because of the market and interest rates relative to 5 or 2 years ago. So those are some of the considerations in terms of where the CDAC came down on the 108 million. There was also a reference in the report to the possibility of increasing the recommendation in the second year of the biennium, depending on how those factors are sort of playing out over the next year.
So last 2 years, we had 123 million that the CDAC recommended. We stayed with that. This year, what the CDAC is recommending, we don't know what the governor is going to recommend in his 2-year budget, of a bonding capacity of 108 million for 2 years. I'm going to leave it at that.
So just to highlight some of the metrics that the committee uses to get to these recommendations. The first one is a look at the per capita debt. So this is the amount of debt per capita to Vermonters, and there's both the state of Vermont and then the median for all 50 states included in there. The median for all 50 states is the purple. The green is the Vermont line. So you can see in the 2000s, about 2015, 16, we were below the median. I think the state of Vermont viewed that as a good thing, but other states have started to level off and even come down in terms of their debt per capita, and Vermont is now more in line with the median. So we strive to sort of be at the median or better. So I think that's a factor that went into the recommendation as well. And then on the next slide, you'll see this as a percentage of personal income. So the first one was debt per capita. This is net tax supported debt as a percent of personal income. You can see the Vermont ranking is in the gray, that's the bar. So we used to be 14, 17, lower is worse if I understand it, higher is better here. We were doing better, as you can see, in the 2000s and into the late 2010, early 2000, that decade, 2010 to 2020. But we're right around the median right now on that. You can see where the other states rank as a percentage of debt by personal income. So right around the median. Another reason for considering the recommendation. And then here's the historic debt rankings. Vermont as debt per capita and debt from personal income. And you can see again, both of those tracked much higher in the early 2000s, mid 2010, up to 2020, and now we're sort of at the median mark. So don't want to fall below the median and would like to improve that if we could, just to get a sense of where we are relative to other states. And then just the last page here, these are the bond rating credit priorities. So again, things that the pension, things that the rating agencies would care about. We touched on the ADEC, but 100% funding of the annual required contribution for state employees and teachers to the system. So making sure the system is as strong as it can be and that it continues to be paid down. Continuing to have strong reserves, or what oftentimes are referred to as a rainy day fund. And then the debt recommendation, the unbroken record of adopting the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee biennium recommendation, 108 million. So these are bond rating credit priorities, as the rating agencies look at Vermont.
So that's our world of bonding. And that's how well the capital bill. John and then Michelle.
Couple things. Explain when you issue a bond or request a bond, the process it takes before it hits the street and I can buy it. Is it tax exempt, state or federal or both?
So in terms of the process, I'll let Scott answer it, just because he's been through one in Vermont, but it is a quite extensive process to get to market.
Right, yeah, so again, we'll start with, work with finance and management to look at this, the spending, kind of determine what the amount of the bond is. And we work with our whole bond team. You know, we have our bond counsel, our financial advisors, the investment bankers who are going to sell it. And we have to come up with, this is an official statement. So this is all the documentation that as a buyer of the bond, you know, this tells you everything, all the disclosure about state finances and everything. We have to put this together. So it usually takes, you know, probably 6 to 8 weeks from the time we start until we're ready to go out. And then once we determine the amount and the pricing thing, we'll go out and we work with the banker, and we generally carve out about a third of the issue and sell them as Vermont citizen bonds. And that's so that you would have a chance to buy those bonds, you know, the individuals in Vermont, we give them the first shot. The bankers will go out and price those. And when we sell a bond, they're 20-year bonds, but we have a piece of that maturing every year for 20 years. So, you know, if we did $100 million issue, it would be $5 million maturing in 20 years. So you would go to your broker and say, okay, I want a bond that's maturing in 5 years or 8 years or whatever. You would work with them. We can't sell directly. We go through the investment bankers.
Okay.
You would go to your broker. There's a whole selling group. So whoever you use, you could go and say, okay, you know, I want to put in this. We will take orders for a day. Realistically, they'll go out like a week ahead and start talking to individuals. And we'll take orders for a day. Once those are already sold, the other 2/3 of the issue, we go out and sell them competitively. And so we'll go out and take bids. We'll put them out, and any big banking firm will put in a bid. And what we'll do is we'll take the lowest true interest cost on that issue. And the reason we only do a third is, you know, we'd love to sell all of it to Vermont individuals, but there's just, you know, there's just not enough money there. And when we do a competitive bid, they end up in lower interest rates anyways, but we want individuals to. So then we'll go out with that competitive bid. They'll buy up, whoever bids on it, they'll buy up the remainder of those. And then it's usually about 2 weeks to get all our closing documents in order. And then your broker will your bond to you. And that's when we'll get the money. And we reimburse the state for the projects that we've already spent or, you know, invested. Until the time comes when we actually draw down projects that and again, the idea is to bond for about the next 12 months worth of spending. So we'll work with financing to draw that down, you know, as the project is spent. So that's the process.
Thank you. Glad you're doing it. If I could, one more. The Vermont Bond Bank, is that a state function?
So it's the municipal bond bank. So that when we talked about the state's moral obligation, the bond bank is part of that. So it's an instrumentality of the state is the way that I would think about it.
Okay.
So it doesn't show up on our, you know, directly on our full faith and credit, but the state's moral obligation is in place. So there is an interplay in the state of Vermont.
So we have another question, Michelle?
Yeah, so my question is, you recommended that we spend 108 million in terms of bonding. I'm wondering if you also have a number recommended that we can look to in terms of spending for this cash fund.
Oh, yeah, right. So I would say wait till the report that's coming out. I think it's due on Thursday. So
Like next week, Thursday?
No, this week, Thursday.
The 15th.
Tomorrow.
15th.
Okay.
Just
Your
Sunday.
question?
Oh, Sunday, okay, so Monday.
So I
we're
had
back.
the date completely
Tuesday.
wrong.
Early next week.
Yeah, maybe it was maybe we had to provide some comments by Thursday. That's why the date was in my head. But
Okay.
yeah, so next week.
So that'll give us a recommended number, just because, I mean, it seems like a pretty substantial decrease in what we're gonna be looking to fund.
Yeah.
And if the cash fund is gonna be able to pick up part of that, that'll be useful for us.
So I missed the question, I'm sorry, I was focused on a text that came through. What was the question?
They talked about 108 being the recommended bonding amount, and I asked if there was a recommended amount that we could spend in terms of the cash fund.
And I was
Put aside 9 million. 10, not quite 10 million we
Per
put
year,
aside.
right?
No. This is another
Well,
one.
Mike said there'll be an official report coming out.
I know, but what we put aside last year.
Yeah.
When we did our budgeting in the cash fund, it was the first time we've established this, was around 9 million is what was put in there. What occurred, we had a lot of revenue coming in that was not expended. And they needed a place to put it in the time being. This is general fund. So they put it in the cash fund. So the cash fund may have a high balance, but it does not mean it all goes to the capital bill. That's what I want to be clear about. Our intent when we did our 2-year capital bill last year, we did not use up all the bonding capacity. And there was some bonds that we paid off early, and there was cash that could come from that in a convoluted way. But we, in essence, put in about $9 million in that cash fund with the theory that that would go towards capital construction projects. So the report will probably come out with a high amount that's in that cash fund, but that is not total for us to use for the capital budget. Our intent was about 9 million. And that's as we left last year in May for that. So I just want to put that on the table for when the report comes out. Wayne,
So are we gonna have a strategy and how to use that?
we will see. We work with appropriations. We got to see what the governor proposes in his capital budget. We don't know. So CDAC recommended a bonding capacity of 108 million. So if there's any cash to be added to that, and what the governor may say, we'll do 5 million cash on top of the 108, which then means for 2 years, you've got 113 million. But that's the governor's recommend. We'll need to work with Appropriations Committee to see how that money in that cash fund, which I hate using that term, but we can't come up with anything else, would be allocated towards our construction projects. So there's a lot of negotiations that will need to occur here on the House side with our colleagues as well as the administration. And then once it leaves the House, it could take on a whole different road in the Senate.
And I'll just mention in the CDAC report, the full report, there is a reference to the pay-go fund or the cash fund. So, that could impact it. So there seemed to be, I wasn't on the CDAC at the time of the recommendation, but there seemed to be a recognition that this fund was there as part of the reason for the recommendation. And then the leaving open of the higher recommendation in the second year, could affect into how much cash was actually available too.
The goal is to get to paying for these projects in the capital bill more with cash than debt. And that's what you do at home. I mean, if you've got a large investment that you know needs to happen, do you want to take out a home equity loan? Do you want to take out a loan? Or do you put money aside for a few years and then pay for it cash? I mean, that's sort of the analogy
And the other, I mean, the good thing that occurs too is, I mean, it takes away interest volatility risk. So you said, geez, I wish I had bonded 2 years ago instead of today, but you had the cash to do it today and you could ignore the interest rate. Then, you know, it wouldn't necessarily delay the implementation of your capital projects if you're paying with cash. So there's more certainty there.
But the bigger issue is when your general fund is not producing well, do you pull money from your general fund? That's the issue. When we built the last correctional facility, and when we paid 100% construction costs of our tech centers back then, we had 2 of them going. We had a correctional facility of about 27 million. It was really more like 24, 23 million. And then we had a tech center at about 14 million. We were flush in the general fund. So we used cash to pay for those 2 projects. We didn't bond for it, but we could do that in 1 year. We did that because we were flush. But this is where the tension will be now with this cash fund, to use cash for our projects versus bonding. It's where's your general fund?
Right.
Or what are the other pressures on your general fund going forward? So that's there's policy and there's politics in that one. Okay. No, you didn't have anything.
I'm good.
You did. So that's another layer that we didn't lay out to the committee yet about our capital budget. I didn't want to confuse people, but that's another layer is how do we play with paying for projects up front with cash? We may really like that, but that may put too much pressure on our general fund because folks have a lot of initiatives that they want funded, both parties. So, and then if we do school construction, where does that lie?
Is that really materializing again?
Hmm?
Is that really materializing? again?
What, school construction? Oh, yeah, that's been percolating for 3 years.
Yeah, no,
Yep,
interesting. That will be interesting.
we don't have
What
a
you
funding
described.
source for it.
Yeah, I understand.
Can I ask a question about that? With the school construction, would the state of Vermont and the local school district ever sort of, the bonding recommendation for the state is based on the state's obligation, ability to perform that obligation. If for schools, could you pull the school district in for the local tax obligation to increase the bonding ability?
So I mean, a municipality would have a similar construct, maybe not just like this, but there's a certain capacity that a municipality would have, like for the Burlington school bonding, I believe they're basically at like
Limit
the limit, yeah.
for that municipality.
And that's looking at sort of their overall debt load, not one given year, but, so every municipality would have a similar sort of, reasonable limit that they could support. And a lot of the school districts they're not school districts, but a lot of municipalities are tight in terms of, what they can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So many of our schools were built around the same time that
Right.
they're in a critical condition at this point, all over the state.
Yeah, it's just hitting us at once. So this is the beauty of this committee. It's just saying, oh my God, it's boring. This is dealing with bricks and mortar and concrete. Parking garage, I'm not interested in that. That's dry as can be and I'm bored. But this is the beauty of this committee. We get to connect policy with the actual dollars.
Mhm.
And when you're looking at the dollars, as a legislator, you really start to develop a little different perspective of, oh yeah, you got these grandiose plans. It really sounds good. And I really want to do this. But when the rubber hits the road and you see all the pressures on our state dollars and you think, oh yeah, well, we can fund this, no problems. And all of a sudden there's a ripple effect out there that you start to experience. As a legislator, your knowledge and your perspective is much broader because you've connected the policy with the actual dollars. And this is what is such an eye-opener when members get appointed to Ways and Means or get appointed to appropriations that haven't had the transportation background or the capital bill background. They come into those committees and they go, oh my God. They're like a deer caught in the headlights. It's like they never had concept of how policy decisions in our policy committees have an impact on our general fund or have an impact on our revenues or have an impact on the capital budget. But you folks are really lucky to be here because you're going to be able to connect those policies with the dollars. And particularly when we get into corrections, particularly when we get into there, we may say, oh yeah, we're just talking about a facility. Or you get into mental health, they're just talking about a facility. But you've got to incorporate that policy into that facility. And that may not be as easy as you think because you're dealing with the actual dollars. And those dollars may not be available for all at once. You have to maybe spread it out over a few years. So you're in a really good position to have a real overview of the legislature. And it's going to be boring. Some parts of it will be boring. And some of it I don't even grasp. But you're gonna see every part of state government one way or another. So when the policy committee that you were on, John, talked about school construction, did you folks really think of the structure of the money piece and how all that, where all that's coming from and who's going to oversee it?
Just that you guys take care of.
The fiscal equivalent of the
I
bomb
bet you
shelter.
did.
Yeah, the bomb shelter.
School construction, we are already paying it. because-
We're paying it through the ed fund.
Right, exactly.
Yes, right.
But the issue with school construction, we've got a crew, I don't want to say a crew, we got a group of folks that don't want to raise taxes. So they don't want a revenue source, dedicated revenue. There's a group, oh no, we can't put more pressure on the ed fund. We have enough pressure on the ed fund. We're already paying it through the ed fund. And then we got another group that's saying, my God, you can't look to the capital bill to pay all of it because we just don't have that capacity. So when people break down in those silos, that's where we've been stuck for 10 years.
Ed Fund's got
12
a
years.
$93 million surplus this year, though.
But they want to have that returned to our local property
Right,
tax.
that's what the governor wants, yes.
You were in the finance department, right?
Smiling away here. Watch.
Very popular, well, anyway. Very popular programs that weren't funded properly that, the education fund could potentially house. There's a lot of, there's a lot of considerations.
Yeah.
And we're going to be in the thick of that. And it ebbs and flows. Anything else? Anything else for the treasurer? Well, welcome to your new position.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We wish you all the luck.
Thank you. Look forward to working with everybody.
Thanks, Amelia. That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was very helpful. Your PowerPoint was,
What about the Kraken variant? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, right.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So as a committee, we have a few more minutes. One thing, I just got a text from the speaker that we do not have ethics training after the floor today.
What time?
We don't have ethics training.
So we'll figure out something. What I'd like to do is have the committee come back as soon after the floor. I
After
think,
the floor, okay.
yeah, we can work until, I'd like maybe, I think I have a meeting that starts at 3:45. It used to be 4:30, but I think they're bumping it up.
The governor's briefings.
There's that, what time is that start?
4:15.
4:15?
Yeah.
That's virtual, right?
No,
Oh, it's in the auditorium?
Yeah,
I
it's in
see,
the-
yeah.
It's in the
Yeah,
auditorium,
yeah,
okay, so we should
Yep.
probably finish up by 4, but I want to do something for that. Maybe what we could do is also just have general committee discussion to see where people are, see where you're at in your
got
thinking.
what, like 2 bills that have been
Right, that's,
essentially thrown this way?
right, and we have 2 bills, and we're going to reach out to the bill sponsors for that. One is sitting right here. Sitting right here.
Nice try.
And then the other is Peter Anthony, talking about state-owned buildings that might be able to be used to house childcare. you know, maybe, are you ready to go at all on yours?
Sure, yeah.
So you could do yours when we come back off the floor. So we would need that bill. What's the number? Do you know what the number is?
34, I think, yeah.
Okay. Page 34. We'd need that posted and then 5 copies as well. And you can give us, what we do traditionally in this committee is when a bill comes in, we do want to give at least 5 minutes or so to the bill sponsor, just to give an overview of the bill. And then once we do that, we could have a day where we've got like maybe half an hour that we're plugging in. Say we have more bills that come in, we'll set that up and have the sponsors come in for each of their bills. And then we have a committee discussion to prioritize, is it something that we're willing to work on? Is it something we want to work on? Sometimes we say, no way do we want to touch this thing. Other times we'll say, the Senate's working on this. Let the Senate bill come over and then maybe we can incorporate this. Or sometimes it's like, we're interested, but we need a little bit more testimony. So we can set up a little bit more testimony to see if we really do want to work on the bill. So that's where we'd be for these 2 bills.
Yeah.
We don't usually get a whole lot of bills, but we might be. You never know.
Yeah.
We might be on that.
I just backed out of one of my bills to let the Senate come over.
Yeah,
Working on
sometimes we work with the Senate, because we
Yeah.
also deal with corrections too.
it.
not
Budget
just-
Council's busy enough to break.
So Mary, Chip and I are going to be doing scheduling at 12:30. The other thing is, and I spoke to Mary and Chip last night about the repro. Are you folks comfortable with what we were thinking on the repro?
Yes.
Reallocation group?
Yes.
Because I'd like to at least have the 3 people that I would like to appoint to this, to start having this in your mind. This, we call it the repro. It's our shorthand. The reallocations. These are dollars that have been targeted towards projects in previous capital bills that haven't gone out the door for a variety of reasons. And we see that on our spreadsheet, right? What we've always done as a committee is have 3 members of the committee work with our joint fiscal office in particular, but they'll also be working with BGS. They might be working with Becky, our legal counsel, to do a deeper dive in the governor's recommend. When the governor's recommend comes out, there will be a section on the governor's spreadsheet of reallocations, and it will be listed. But there's also other projects out there that maybe they decided not to reallocate money. Maybe we find something that, hey, you're just holding on to this money for 3 years and it's not encumbered. And make a recommendation to our full committee and say, yeah, there's like $500,000 out there with all these projects that we could reallocate. So I would like 3 members of this committee to be part of that, to be that repro group. I'm gonna appoint Mary, because Mary understands this, has a capital bill background, and understands the reallocation. Because the 3 people that were on it are no longer on the committee. I'd like to have Chip, and I'd like to have Troy. The 3 of you to work together. And I'm gonna be calling you Tori.
You've only done it once.
No, I've done it more than that in my brain, because we have a daughter-in-law who's Tori, and it's Tori. Just, so you're Troy. But I'd like to have you 3 be the reallocation subcommittee to kind of work. So once you get the governor's budget, you'll be working on that. What I like to do is chair of a committee. It doesn't always work out, but I really work hard. I want every member to be involved in something that you work on. It could be something that pops up in the capital bill. It could be a bill that's introduced. It could be something that pops up with corrections. But I really try to get everybody involved in something. And I really work in terms of trying to understand where your skill sets are and where your interests are. And usually it's not just one person working on something. It could be, but usually I try to mix it up. So we've got, if somebody's really strong in one skill set and somebody who's really strong in that topic, I can put those 2 folks together to work on something. So that's how I like to work. And if anybody's interested in some things that start percolating in the capital budget or in corrections, let me know. Let Chip know. So that, we get a handle on where we can plug you folks in. Eric.
When the budget is finally presented on the floor, you usually divide up the sections between people. So if they know that they're gonna own a piece of the section earlier in the process,
Yeah, that one's a little
it just helps them
Yeah.
feel more confident going out and explaining.
And this also brings up another thing that Chip and Mary and I need to think about. And also, if you're interested in something, let us know too, because I just don't want to be appointing. If some people want to volunteer for some things and we think it's a good fit, it's good. But we're going to need a liaison to the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee has a liaison to us. And in the past, it was Representative Trevor Squirrel, that was the corrections one. We also have Representative Harrison. Jim Harrison was our liaison for the BGS portion. So for probes, what we've done in the past, Mary, help me on this. We had 2 people for corrections. It was you and Kurt. And then we had 1 person for BGS, which was Marcia. So we'll have to do that, and that's to help with BAA, and that's to help with the general fund budget, to figure out what piece of their budget deals with BGS and how that coordinates with us, what piece deals with corrections. And corrections is the bigger lift, not BGS, and how that deals with us. We also will need a liaison to House Judiciary Committee, because when you get into corrections issues, there's a lot of criminal justice issues. Or courthouses, when we get into building courthouses, or that percolates up there too. So we'll need a liaison to House Judiciary. We might also need a liaison to the House Human Services Committee. What I'm thinking is, if we decide to do the bill with state-owned property with childcare, that's a linkage with human services. I already got in mind 2 people. But I want to hear the testimony from the sponsor, but I have in mind two of you already for that, in case we decide to work on that.
Alice, you might want to just tell them what a liaison means. We'll go.
Okay, good thought. A liaison is you hook in with the respective liaison in that committee. So in appropriations, whoever does the BGS for us would hook in. I'm assuming it would probably be Representative Harrison, Jim Harrison.
Yeah, he told me this morning.
It would sit down with Jim and just say, hey, what's in the budget that impacts BGS that we need to look at or be aware of? Or he could come to us and say, hey, we got this piece upstairs. Can you guys take a look at it? Well, we're going to look at the person who's really working with the probes on that particular issue. In corrections, it's all over the map. There's a lot with corrections. That's why there's 2 people. It's working like, we got Justice Reinvestment 2, which is going to be a heavy lift in educating you folks in terms of what that is, where the money goes. There's out-of-state beds. There could be training of correctional officers.
Transitional pieces.
Yeah, so there's a lot involved, but it's working with that committee member, that other committee that has the money. And to make sure that those dollars are being appropriated in concert with where we're headed, but also in the policy of corrections. In terms of the liaison with Judiciary, you'll be working with your counterpart in Judiciary Committee that knows that they've got some issues coming in that's going to have an impact on corrections. Like, they're really going to look at probation more than we are, because probation is hooked with the courts. But probation impacts corrections because our field service officers are supervising folks who are on probation. And some folks with probation have an underlying sentence that then impacts us. So that's where the person from Judiciary will say, hey, we got this bill coming in. We got this issue that's being presented. I think your committee needs to look at it. So that's the connection. Or if we've got a bill that deals with workforce training of correctional officers or of inmates, we're gonna need somebody to work with Commerce Committee because they deal with workforce training to see how that can delve. So those are the ways that we kind of reach out. If we have correctional officers, last year, we had a lot of correctional officers wanted increased salaries, they wanted increased benefits, they wanted increased help in their scheduling and overtime, and they kept coming to us. Well, it's really Government Operations Committee that deals with those type of issues for our state employees. So we went to Government Operations Committee and say, hey, can we have a joint meeting and hear this out? So that's, we reach out to other committees.
They did a lot of that for the corrections officers, so,
Well, yeah, I know. And we did some of that right in here.
yeah, I know.
For that. So we're reaching out, on average, you know, they're talking about legal counsel, our legislative staff. We have Becky who does our corrections bill. Our capital bill. She will help a little bit in some things with corrections, but we depend on 3 lawyers for correctional issues that staff judiciary. Michelle Childs, Eric Fitzpatrick, and Ben Novogratz. We'll deal with Ben most of the time. If we get into mental health issues, which we have, we'll deal with the legal counsel that addresses mental health. We deal with educational issues, we'll deal with the legislative counsel that deals with educational issues. So in any one session, we can be dealing with anywhere from 6 to 9 of our legislative counsel lawyers because of topics that we're going to be addressing. And sometimes it's hard to schedule because they're so tied up in other committees. So we're pretty broad in what we deal with.
I think it's lunchtime now, Chair.
It's lunch, so we'll go off of YouTube.